We humans are embodied creatures. It is in and through our bodies that we live and move and have our being in God's good creation, at least for the time being. To be an embodied creature is necessarily to be finite. Our bodies impose limits, often unwanted and sometimes severe, on what we can do and what we can be. My unathletic body, for instance, ruined my boyhood dream of being a Major League Baseball pitcher, or much of a Little League pitcher for that matter. Illness and injury, pain and suffering are endemic to the human condition, and our bodies wear out over time. People grow old and they die. To be an embodied creature is necessarily to be mortal. Nothing I have said thus far should be a source of despair. There is nothing wrong with being finite and mortal. That is how God created us, to be participants in his good creation. To loathe our finitude and our mortality is to also despise the Creator. In the beginning, God declares his human creature to be good and reaffirms that declaration in the incarnation. The Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. God in Jesus Christ becomes a human being, and he is not spared suffering and death. To be clear, I am not suggesting that it is easy to be embodied. To the contrary, to be embodied is difficult and it is demanding. I'm still not entirely happy that God chose not to bless me with an athletic body. Prolonged pain and suffering can deaden one's spirit. I mourn the death of friends and loved ones. Being embodied is always a risky enterprise. And yet, this is how God created, affirms, loves, and redeems us. It is important to remember that within the Christian tradition, disparaging the body has always been the rhetoric of heresy. The body is evil because it imprisons the soul. We must be saved from our bodies. It is only an immaterial spiritual life that really matters. The body is at best a temporary nuisance that should be ignored as much as possible. But this is all, again, the rhetoric of heresy. And it is to contradict the incarnation, the cornerstone of Christian faith. Jesus Christ is fully God and fully human, indivisibly an embodied soul and ensouled body. Christians must resist the Gnostics and Manichaeans of every age, and they have done so. In Beth Felker Jones's words, in the Christian tradition, the temptation to denigrate the body has been continually reasserted and consistently rejected. Successfully resisting this temptation, however, is only solving half of the problem. How, in turn, do we live out our lives faithfully as embodied creatures? This is partly a question of stewardship. How do we care for physical bodies? Bodies require a lot of maintenance. We need food, clothing, shelter, and rest. Basic needs that must be met day in and day out, and we cannot meet these needs on our own. Most of us rely on the work of others to provide our food, make our clothes, build our homes, manufacture our beds. Our very survival depends on countless routine interactions and exchanges. Although these activities are mundane and ordinary, they are not trivial, but are quite important, for they sustain the lives of embodied persons. In the commonplace activities we often take for granted, we fulfill to a large extent the second great commandment, to love our neighbors, by tending and contributing to one another's material well-being. As embodied beings, we depend on others. We depend on our neighbors. This dependency is most noticeable in respect to healthcare. At some point, Each of us are literally at the mercy of others, whether it be at the beginning or end of life, or for some prolonged illness in between. If it were not for nurses and doctors, the quality of our lives would be significantly diminished. It is through medicine that collectively we care for neighbors who are most vulnerable and in greatest need. There has always been a strong commitment to health care in the Christian tradition, originating in Jesus' ministry of healing and keeping company with the sick and the infirmed. And later, Christians were at the forefront of establishing hospices and hospitals. Deeply ingrained within Christian teaching and practice is the conviction of the body as an object of care, a belief that went on to inform a more secular provision of medical care. In many respects, physicians were called to help their patients deal with the unavoidable challenges entailing their finitude and their mortality. This calling is now undergoing a subtle but steady revision in response to a shift in how the human body is perceived and how it is valued. The shift is from perceiving the body as an object of care to a problem to be solved. There is a growing perception of the body as an unwanted constraint against the will, and medicine should be dedicated to overcoming the limits of being embodied. In short, our bodies are too weak and inefficient, and they wear out too quickly. Consequently, physicians are not expected to help patients manage and come to terms with their finitude and mortality, but to wage an incessant war against them with a growing arsenal of sophisticated technological weapons. The body should be an artifact of medical ingenuity instead of an arbitrary stew of DNA. The body is a problem to be solved, and a lot of time, effort, and money are being poured into finding that solution. How did we get here? To answer that question, I'm afraid I need to inflict a brief history of bioethics upon you. But don't worry, I'll try to make it as short and painless as possible. The advent of contemporary bioethics occurred roughly in the mid-1960s, partly in response to unethical research conducted on unwilling or unknowing patients. More broadly, it was also a reaction to such headline-catching breakthroughs as the first heart transplant and birth of a baby using in vitro fertilization. Hence the subsequent tendency of bioethics to fixate on issues at the beginning and end of life. The first phase was dominated by theologians. Their principal task was to create a person-centered medical practice. These theologians were troubled that the success of modern medicine was also diminishing the personhood of patients, who were seen and treated as collections of biological parts and systems. It was the disease rather than the person that the doctor was treating. This reductionist tendency was most acute at the end of life. Increasingly, the process of dying was occurring over an extended period of time with the aid of surgical interventions, drugs, deployment of ventilators, and the like. Patients were dying slowly in pieces rather than as whole persons. Paul Ramsey was one of the early theologians who reacted forcefully against this state of affairs. He insisted that medical care should always be person-centered, because every patient was not an assemblage of deteriorating biology, but an embodied soul and an ensouled body who needed to be treated as such. The force of his argument is captured in the provocative titles of such essays as On Only Caring for the Dying and The Indignity of Dying a Death with Dignity. For Ramsey, medicine was not a relationship between physician and patient, but one person caring for another person. The reign of the theologians was short-lived. The primary reason for their demise was that although they shared a dedication to person-centered medical care, there was absolutely no agreement on who or what is a person. At one extreme, it was insisted that being alive is the sole criterion of personhood. Consequently, patients should always be treated as persons from the moment of conception until the last breath. At the other extreme, it was insisted that multiple criteria, such as consciousness, brain function, or minimal IQ, could be used to determine the presence or absence of personhood. Consequently, some patients could be treated as non-persons at various stages of life. This lack of consensus was not very useful in guiding the actual practice of medicine. So the second stage of bioethics, the philosophers moved in to fill the void. They too lacked a consensus regarding personhood, but they devised a useful rule of thumb. To oversimplify, a person is someone who is capable of making decisions that he believes is in his self-interest. If someone is not capable, then a responsible and conscientious person should be assigned to make those decisions on his behalf. The rule of thumb has helped develop 4 familiar ethical principles that have come to dominate bioethics in medical practice: non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, and autonomy. Respecting autonomy bears the heaviest weight among these principles because it preserves a patient-centered practice of medicine. Healthcare professionals can only do what I allow them to do to me, except in emergencies. Bioethics moved away from the patient as person to the patient as autonomous person. I believe we are entering a third phase, a transition from the patient as autonomous person to the patient as consumer. In this transition, the philosophers are being replaced by managers and lawyers. This consumerist stance is a logical consequence of autonomy. If patients should determine their course of treatment, why should they settle for a limited range of options that healthcare providers offer? They should demand more, and they are. What are consumers of healthcare demanding? Increasingly, they want medicine to help them overcome unwanted constraints imposed by the body, especially as they grow older. Enhancing physical and cognitive performance is complementing and supplementing the traditional medical practices of prevention, diagnosis, and therapy. Consumers want their healthcare providers to help them live long, physically vigorous, and mentally alert lives. Hence, the image of retirees is no longer oldsters dozing off in rocking chairs, but mature individuals endlessly playing golf, swimming laps, and attending concerts. Mick Jagger will probably never call it quits. And if we take autonomy seriously as the ability of a person to take actions on their behalf and their respective self-interests, then no compelling moral objection can be raised against healthcare providers satisfying this demand, so long as the medical products on offer are relatively safe and reliable. These 3 phases of bioethics, the patient as person, the patient as autonomous person, and the patient as consumer, are accompanied by 2 roughly corresponding transitions in medical practice. The first transition is from paternalistic practice of medicine to one that is contractual. In paternalistic medicine, the physician, in virtue of his or her specialized training, expertise, and experience, knew what was best for the patient, period. When I was young, for example, a visit to the doctor went something like this. I would state my complaint. The doctor would then poke and probe me with various instruments, and then tell me to do this and that. End of conversation. And in the next visit, if I confessed that I had failed to do what I was told, I could expect a severe scolding. I'm not suggesting that these physicians were tyrants. To the contrary, they were often wise, kind, and benevolent. But it was clear that they were in charge, and my role was to obey their commands. Visit to the doctor's office is no longer like this. After stating my complaint, and as I grow older, I complain much more frequently, my doctor prescribes various tests and may refer me to a specialist or two. Once all the data has been collected, my doctor or a specialist describes a range of treatment options, and I decide which, if any, I will undertake. In this contractual relationship between physician and autonomous patient, a number of safeguards are needed to protect both parties. Hence, the informed consent documents, advanced care directives, and durable power of attorney forms that are constantly kept on file and updated in small print. The second current transition is from a contractual practice of medicine to consumerist healthcare. In this transition, healthcare providers are asking consumers what they think of their products. Are you happy with the services we provide? And what else do you want? The signs of this transition are subtle, but telling. Two simple examples will suffice. First, within a day or two after following a visit to the doctor's office, my healthcare provider emails me a link to an evaluation form. On a scale of 1 to 10, I am asked how happy I was with my recent visit. Most of the questions involve the ease in making an appointment, friendliness of the staff, comfort of the waiting room, and how long I waited, and so on. The final question is always how likely I might be to recommend this office to a friend or family member. My healthcare provider is always measuring my satisfaction with the services it provides. But they also want to know what else I want. The second example, on a visit to my doctor's office, a nurse, as usual, updated my charts, weighed me, took my blood pressure and temperature, and then left. And as usual, I waited for the doctor. But this time, a young woman not wearing a white jacket came in and introduced herself as my healthcare concierge. She described briefly what she was hired to do and gave me her business card and a pamphlet. And then she asked me, what lifestyle goals could my healthcare provider help me achieve? Now, I find this to be a curious question because it presumes that fixating on my health has become such a domineering part of my existence that I cannot imagine living a good life without the assistance of my healthcare provider. Unfortunately, the presumption is probably correct, especially as I'm aging. For we aging people want assistance in overcoming the physical and mental decline that accompany growing old. It is not an unreasonable request. The healthcare industry has tapped into the strong desire to live long and healthy lives. And to a remarkable extent, this demand is being met through improved diet and exercise, drugs, joint replacements, and other surgical interventions. Those having access to excellent health care do tend to live longer and healthier lives. The healthcare industry is promising its customers that it can help them live better lives for a lengthier period of time. And to be clear, there is nothing inherently wrong in striving to become better. Nothing wrong in trying to make better human beings or to become better at being human. But in offering the promise of long and healthy lives, can healthcare ever fully satisfy the demand? If one is healthy, can a life ever be too long? Have you ever met a person complaining about being too healthy? This dilemma is compounded by an unfortunate phrase that appeared in the bioethics and medical literature a little over a decade ago. It states, aging is a disease. I think this was meant as a shorthand reference to a list of maladies associated with aging, such as declining physical strength and dexterity, memory loss, slower cognition, susceptibility to illness, and the like. And as I mentioned previously, we are making notable advances in treating an aging population. But if aging is a disease that can be treated, doesn't this imply that it might eventually be cured? And what would it mean to cure aging? It would probably mean preserving an ideal age once it had been reached, in conjunction with enhancing certain physical and cognitive capabilities. Once this age is reached, medical treatments would be deployed to prevent deterioration. In short, humans would age to a certain point, but no further. More importantly, living this ideal age would be sustained for a very long time, perhaps indefinitely. If aging is cured, then no one need die except by choice or misfortune. Now, lest you think me daft, there are some clever and well-funded people who are pursuing R&D projects designed to radically extend human longevity. And the word immortality is starting to be whispered with a growing confidence that it is an achievable goal. Parenthetically, I don't know if this confidence is genuine or bravado, but in either case, it is starting to capture public attention and the public imagination, especially the attention of aging healthcare consumers. This fascination with achieving personal immortality is most pronounced among the transhumanists. In the words of Max More, a leading transhumanist philosopher, aging and death victimizes all humans, thereby placing an unacceptable imposition on the human race. Consequently, technology should be developed that extend longevity not by just a few years, but by centuries, perhaps millennia, or even better, forever. There are three overlapping strategies at play to achieve this goal. The first may be characterized as biological immortality. With anticipated developments in genetic and biotechnologies, the average lifespan can be increased dramatically, perhaps indefinitely, it is hoped. The twofold challenge is to prevent the shortening of the telomeres and to ensure that degenerative mutations do not occur in cellular replication. In other words, to eliminate the Xerox effect. If you take a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, it keeps fading. And that's what happens in our cellular reproduction. This would always be copying the original, is what the goal is, so that you don't have the fading. In addition, the immune system would be genetically enhanced and deleterious genetic defects removed or corrected to protect individuals from life-threatening and chronic diseases or disabilities. Aubrey de Grey, for instance, contends that living for 150 to 200 years will soon become routine. With further technological innovation, much more dramatic increases will be forthcoming. And immortality is not out of the question, since infinite cellular rejuvenation cannot be ruled out in principle. For de Grey, winning the war against aging, and therefore death, is simply a matter of more efficient engineering. The DNA that natural selection haphazardly concocted simply needs to be redesigned in line with human values and purposes. Moreover, there is a moral imperative driving de Grey's quest for biological immortality, for he insists that mortality is not simply an unfortunate aspect of being human, but is a tragedy that can and should be overcome through targeted research and technological development. If, however, human biology proves less pliable than hoped for, all is not lost, for there is the second approach of bionic immortality. With anticipated advances in nanotechnology and robotics, as various body parts wear out, they will be replaced with artificial substitutes. Synthetic blood vessels and skin will replace their less durable natural counterparts, and as muscles deteriorate, arms and legs will be assisted or replaced with sophisticated prosthetics. Nanobots will be injected to surgically repair diseased organs, and neuroenhancers inserted into the brain to prevent the deterioration of memory and other cognitive functions. Admittedly, these artificial substitutes will wear out over time, but they will be replaced with new and improved models. Presumably, such maintenance could be undertaken indefinitely. In principle, a biotic being could live forever, so long as the artificial parts are properly maintained, repaired, and replaced. Additionally, physical and cognitive functions will not only be preserved, but also enhanced. Individuals will enjoy the benefits of improved cardiovascular systems, greater strength and agility, and enhanced intelligence and memory. There are unfortunately some liabilities accompanying this approach. The electronic and mechanical systems can malfunction, and a cyborg is still vulnerable to accidents or malicious acts ending in death. Although a predominantly artificial body is an improvement, it is still not an ideal solution in overcoming the limits of embodiment. This leads to the third and most speculative approach, virtual immortality. Following such visionary leaders in the fields of artificial intelligence and robotics as Ray Kurzweil and Hans Moravec, the information contained in the brain that constitutes a person's memories, experience, and personality can be digitized. In the near future, they contend, highly sophisticated imaging devices will scan the brain to collect this information and in turn upload it into a computer. Once this information has been organized and stored, it can then be downloaded into a robotic or virtual reality host. With frequent updated and multiple backups, the uploading and downloading process can be repeated, perhaps indefinitely. Consequently, one's virtual self is virtually immortal. Now, it may be objected that a person cannot be reduced to a series of zeros and ones that could be then shuffled about between robotic bodies and virtual reality programs. But Kurzweil and Moravec are quick to reply that since the mind is not a material object, and the mind is ultimately what a person is, then it cannot be anything other than information. A personality is comprised of a pattern of organized data that is created and stored over time. A biological body is merely a natural prosthetic preserving this pattern. Unfortunately, nature has not produced a very reliable or enduring prosthetic, so technology must be used to make a better model. In liberating the mind from the biological body, nothing essential is lost. For if the information pattern of a person's identity is preserved, then in Moravec's words, I am preserved, the rest is mere jelly. In short, technology can and should be developed to save individuals from the poor jelly-like conditions of being human. To understate, the transhumanists want medicine to undertake an ambitious and transformative enterprise. Why settle for making human beings better when you can make them better than human? Why not cast off our poor jelly-like bodies to become all that we can be and even more? Why not free the human race from a nature that is indifferent to our flourishing? To return to Max More, in an excerpt from his letter to Mother Nature. Mother Nature, truly we are grateful for what you made us. No doubt you did the best you could. However, with all due respect, we must say that you have in many ways done a poor job with the human constitution. You have made us vulnerable to disease and damage. You compel us to age and to die, just as we are beginning to attain wisdom. What you have made is glorious, yet deeply flawed. We have decided that it is time to amend the human constitution. Now, I am not an engineer nor the son of an engineer, so I don't know if the technological advances required to amend the human constitution are possible or not. I don't know if the transhumanist vision is realistic or simply a mere fantasy. But the rhetoric is starting to shape public desire. And if healthcare consumers increasingly demand longer and healthier lives to be made better than human, how can providers, if it is within their power to do so, resist fulfilling this demand? Particularly if they want to satisfy their customers. As the admittedly extreme transhumanist vision discloses, consumerist healthcare is transforming the practice of medicine. It is no longer focused on the body as an object of care, but seeks to liberate the autonomous person from his or her jelly-like prison. Medicine is coming to resemble an engineering project for solving the problem of the human body. Now, from time to time, I'm accused of being a bioethicist. And the accusation doesn't really bother me because I suppose there are worse things in life. But whenever I do fraternize with the Bioethics Guild, I find that as a Christian theologian, I have a hard sell to make. I want to say something like this. Because of my theological and moral convictions, I believe that it is good to be embodied. That is how we were created. And if it is good to be embodied, then it is also necessary to be finite and mortal. It is a package deal. My principal reason for this insistence is that I believe that a good life is more akin to a story than an engineering project. A good story has a beginning, a middle, and a fitting end. Without an end, there is no story, only endless and pointless rhetoric. It is the end that ultimately makes us human and humane. To eliminate death from the storyline would change what it means to be human, but I'm not convinced the change would be for the better. In short, I want a medical practice that helps me come to terms with my finitude and my mortality, rather than treating me as an engineering project. Now, I know that much of what I have said is highly critical of the current state of healthcare and where it is heading. So a few words of praise are in order. I have no desire to return to a paternalistic practice of medicine, and I appreciate the safeguards protecting my autonomy because I should take responsibility for my healthcare decisions. I am personally grateful for the preventive diagnostic and therapeutic strides that have been made. I will not bore you with the details, but without these advances, there's a good chance I would be dead today. I am also a voracious consumer of medical goods and services. I greedily embrace almost anything my doctor suggests that might improve my quality of life. I think it's ironic that after all this criticism of transhumanism, my scheduled knee replacement in November will be with a robotic-assisted knee, but we needn't digress. To borrow from St. Augustine, I know I need to be more attentive to my finitude and my mortality, but not now. We have already started down the road of making human beings better, perhaps even better than human. I don't think there is any turning back. But following Hannah Arendt, sometimes you must stop and think about what you're doing, where you are heading. Course corrections can be made along a journey. And so I conclude with 3 cautionary notes, pauses, if you will, down this journey of becoming better humans or better than human. First cautionary note. The Canadian philosopher George Grant was fond of quoting a Spanish proverb. Take what you want, said God. Take it and pay for it. This adage is a reminder that no act is ever free. Any action has its costs, and we cannot know precisely what those costs will be in advance. It will be no different in using medicine to make us better humans, perhaps better than human. What will we give up, and what will be lost over time in solving the problem of being embodied? And will the price prove reasonable, or will it be exorbitant? Second cautionary note. Overcoming the constraints imposed by the body is a quest for perfection, another heresy, Pelagianism. When we solve the problem of the body, presumably we will be free to do whatever we want. A perfect life awaits us. But there are hidden traps in this quest for perfection. Around 50 years ago, John Passmore wrote a book titled The Perfectibility of Man. He chronicled various historical attempts at achieving intellectual, spiritual, moral, or racial perfection. All of these efforts failed for different reasons, but each shared one thing in common. Chasing after an ill-defined goal of perfection was always accompanied by rising levels of intolerance of those judged to be unfit. Those perceived recalcitrant enemies of progress became an insufferable nuisance and were often subjected to unspeakable cruelty or violence. I don't know if the latest round of chasing after perfection will fail once again. But I think an aphorism attributed to Mark Twain is right in insisting that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Perhaps we should remind ourselves of St. Augustine's teaching that it is in the bonds of imperfection that make us human and keep us humane. Perhaps we are at our best when we admit rather than trying to eliminate our weaknesses and care for one another accordingly. The third cautionary note. Idwal Jones penned High Bonnet, a novel of Epicurean adventures. It is a story about chefs and gourmets in late 19th century France. Toward the end of the story, the master chef, Francois, dies, fittingly, in a kitchen while preparing a meal. His most loyal student makes the following observation. Not originality, but perfection is the lodestar of the virtuoso, who knows that a perfect work cannot be improved upon, and that it takes more skill and conscience to make a vibrant, living copy than to create a poor original. If we cannot resist the attraction of pursuing perfection, then can we at least be clear about what we are trying to perfect? The effort to make human beings better than human will, I believe, end in poor originality. Would not a vibrant, living copy of being human be preferable, namely, as creatures created to love God and their neighbors who were created by their Creator as embodied, finite, and mortal beings? Maybe, just maybe, this perfection of neighbor love is worth pursuing. And can we devise a practice of medicine that will actually help us achieve this end? I interject neighbor love because I fear that creating a loveless world will be an unintended consequence of solving the problem of the body. Why? Because genuine love requires risk and it requires vulnerability. Unless you are willing to take the risk of having your heart broken, you are not really in love. Finitude and mortality drive us toward one another. Otherwise, we could not survive, much less flourish. The more autonomous we become, the less we need one another. We need not take on risks of a burdensome love that might end in heartbreak. Solving the problem of the body may result in greater safety, but safety is not synonymous with love, and nowhere in the Bible are we commanded to play it safe. To illustrate what I have in mind, I close with a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In Rappaccini's Daughter, we encounter the highly acclaimed physician, Dr. Rappaccini, his lovely daughter, Beatrice, and a young medical student, Giovanni, who is living in a guest room. One of the chief features of the villa is a large garden that is filled with exotic plants, each one of them highly poisonous. The slightest contact is lethal, and even a quick sniff of their aroma causes illness. Yet Beatrice is seen embracing the plants and breathing deeply of their fragrance. As the story unfolds, we learn that since her birth, her father has been slowly giving her increased dosages of the poisons he has been extracting from the garden. The effect is to make her immune to any and all diseases. Giovanni and Beatrice fall in love. Yet through their courtship, they never embrace, kiss, or hold hands. For like the plants from the garden, Beatrice is lethal to the touch. In the meantime, Dr. Rappaccini has been administering the same procedure to Giovanni without his knowledge. The father wants to create an intimate companion for his lonely daughter. When Giovanni learns that he too is being made invulnerable but poisonous, he is appalled. Arrival of Dr. Rappaccini on the medical faculty gives Giovanni an antidote that purportedly will make both he and Beatrice normal again. The couple make a pact, but Beatrice insists that she takes the antidote first, and she dies. Dr. Rappaccini has achieved his goal of preventing his daughter Beatrice from contracting a deadly disease. She will be spared needless pain and suffering and given a power and invincibility that few enjoy in confronting a threatening world. Yet it will be an isolated life, devoid of any physical contact. She can neither touch nor be touched by others, for she is literally poisonous to anyone other than herself. Her life will also be devoid of any intimate and lasting relationships, a crushing fate as her father recognizes in his desperate attempt to transform Giovanni into a suitable but equally poisonous companion. Their invulnerability has made them something less than human. Will solving the problem of the body entail the demise of our humanity? Perhaps. And Hawthorne warns, there is no going back. When Beatrice finds someone with whom she can purportedly share her life with fully, Giovanni is appalled by what he is becoming. Out of her love, she agrees to forsake her invulnerability and return with her lover to a natural state where together they may risk a loving embrace. The attempt, however, proves futile and deadly. For her transformation is complete and irreversible. In Hawthorne's haunting words, to Beatrice, so powerfully had her earthly part been wrought upon by Rappaccini's skill, as poison had been life, so the powerful antidote was death. Perhaps, after all, our bodies are not problems to be solved, but a means through which we love God and neighbor. And I hope we can live with that. Thank you.
I have a question about the people who promote the idea of a virtual immortality. It seems to me that, just thinking it through, that the best case scenario for a success there would be to produce another me, one who is superior to me, is going to live longer, and has the disturbing quality of thinking that all my things belong to it. I'm going to die. What possible rationale could I have to think that when I die, I'm suddenly going to wake up as him?
Yeah, I mean, well, it is a dilemma because who is the I? because there's multiple backups. So which of those backups is you? I mean, that's sort of the problem with the whole assumption in that approach. But that problem is not resolved. It's simply that basically I, in some form, will continue forever. So it is the notion of the full malleability of what it means to be alive. So that when you think about it, what does this do? If simply life is an artifact of our will, then you need the technology to open up all the possibilities. So we know the previous lecture we talked about, the limits of what it means to be trans. This would give you, I mean, that's no longer a problem. You could be a female in one experience, male in another, lesbian in one, gay in another, bestiality, whatever you want is at your fingertips. So that I think it is a notion, it is a benighted notion of freedom as simply being limited, having no external constraints against the will. And whatever you will is your identity. And that's malleable. There's nothing given about that. I think that's what the ultimate thing is, so that the goal, so that therefore the question that you raised, who is the I is whatever you wish it to be.
But there's no continuity.
There's no continuity, yes, correct.
So how can I define that as immortality?
Because it exists. And that's about as best an answer as I think you're going to get to. I mean, what would enrich their conversation, I think, is that the ones that believe in this approach are almost exclusively in AI and robotics. There's none of the neuroscience is involved in this or any other biological sciences. And so that they're not really, they've really not addressed the question of how much a particular, for example, mind and body are joined. Okay, and can it be separated? They just assume the information can be extracted, stored, and reloaded. Okay, and I suppose one answer that could be given is you would have a master copy that would eventually collect all of the incoming information, and that would be you. Perhaps, but I'm guessing at that answer. I've really never heard him answer that question.
Just very quickly, it sounds like without the Christian concept of a soul, you can't really deal with this problem, because I think for us, it is the soul which is the real me. And that soul binds mind and body together. And if you're not, if you don't have that way of thinking about humans, then sure, why not take the data of the mind and stick it in a new body? So maybe it's a kind of an intellectual battle that we'll never win, apart from the religious question.
Yeah, and there's where there's a kind of bad similarity in that there's an agreement about the non-materiality of one's identity, but it's a very different understanding of what that non-materiality entails.
What sort of percentages of research, if you want to call it research, is funded by private individuals or corporations versus, say, NIH dollars? Just as a...
I think it's, as best to my knowledge, it's almost all private. I mean, I know that Peter Thiel is a big investor. Google is another big investor.
With the conversation on immortality, how have you seen the response to the coronavirus as this quest for immortality?
Say a bit more. What I'm not sure.
It seemed like a lot of people spent their time trying to avoid the coronavirus as this desire to live as long as possible at whatever means possible. Kind of like what I was seeing with trying to visit my shut-ins in the nursing home. You couldn't go in. They would not let you go in because they just want to keep them alive, and to the detriment of being able to receive pastoral care and be able to spend time with loved ones and family.
Yeah. Well, I think it partly doesn't have something to believe that when you really believe this is all there is, you're going to do anything to preserve it for as long as possible.
So kind of go back to Professor's comment on the need for soul.
Right. And if you don't really believe in a soul, then the preservation of physical life is really the best you can do. Also, I think there's a residual ethic among healthcare workers that they know right now they know they're never going to win the war against death, but it's not going to happen on my watch. Okay, so you protect people even when it's not to their best interest because they don't really believe there's such a thing as a good death. Where I think within Christian tradition, we do think about a good death. And a good death is in communion with our loved ones, in the presence of their company. And I just think for healthcare providers now, that's just inexplicable almost. That to use the term good death just doesn't exist except in terms of assisted suicide or euthanasia, which because it's your choice. So you at least control the means of it. So that's, again, it's a partial answer, but I think that was all a part of it. And to this day, I don't fully understand why they insisted upon keeping people in long-term facility, rest homes, isolated from loved ones, when supposedly weren't they there to care for their last days.
Our final question for Dr. Waters.
First, thank you, and I appreciate your comments about how having an end is a part of the human reality. I was thinking in different science fiction books where they've played with this concept of immortality, and I'm thinking back to, right now I'm reading Dune, and there's a character, Duncan Idaho, and he later comes back as Hate, and there's a big conflict about who his identity is. Later that inspired Spock, who was brought back alive, and he's a different person than he was before. Anyway, has this ever been played with in bioethics? Because there's a lot of thought that goes into these characters and their value and their contribution to life. Just thought from your scholarly point of view, has there ever been any play with this in the bioethic realm?
Early on when it was dominated by theologians, that was a viable concept to be talked about because there was a larger kind of framework, moral framework to go in with the discussion. Right now, bioethics is largely a discussion on procedures of how is it fair, how is it just, and things like that. I got in trouble because I wrote a brief article as when did bioethics become boring? And it was basically, I think, when we lost sight of exactly those kinds of questions because it's, we need to talk about what is a good life, what is a good death, what is a holy life, what is a holy death. And those are not public conversations anymore. It's more or less, we have reduced everything to whatever the individual decides it is. And no one's in a position to judge that. And yet I think you probably do need a communal setting to help you think clearly about that.